Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the SOMM TV podcast. I have a really exciting episode for you today. My guest is Jacy Tops, the assistant editor for print and the host of the Wine Enthusiast podcast. She is one of the really smart minds over at Wine Enthusiast doing great stuff. The interesting thing is this isn't just a SOMM TV podcast.
Hi, welcome to the Wine Enthusiast podcast. This is Jacy Tops, assistant editor at print here, and I'm super excited because we have a really cool podcast. I am co-hosting a podcast with Jason Wise, who is SOMM TV director and host of SOMM TV podcast.
Let's start this off. The story we have is one of the wildest I think I've ever come across in the wine world. You know, I made the SOMM films, and we've done hundreds of things for SOMM TV, the streaming service. And this came across my desk, and I was sort of blown away by it. Let me ask you, when I say the term old vine, and you see that on a label, what does that mean to you?
I'm thinking wine from a vine that's 20, 30 years old.
20, 30 years old, old vine.
Yeah.
It's always one of these terms. It's not like a regulated thing. In our glasses, we have a wine from a vine that was planted nearly in the mid-1700s. And there's a new documentary on SOMM TV called The Oldest Vine. This vine was planted in a place that you can't imagine. It's not Napa, and it's not New York State, it's not Sonoma, it's not Santa Barbara, and it's not Washington State. It's nowhere you would think of when it comes to all of the places that wine grows. It's from one of the largest metropolitan areas in the United States. It's in Los Angeles. And in the 1700s, the Spanish came here and planted a vine, a mission grape, that hybridized miraculously with a native grape. And it produced a vine that is still alive today. And on today's pod, we are going to tell you the story of the oldest vine in the world that is still making wine today. So the story starts in what would have been the most remote part of the Spanish Empire in the 1750s. And when I say remote, I'm talking about the farthest flung area where Europe had its greedy little fingers in what they called the New World. Is that appropriate? So this would have taken place in modern day Los Angeles. But back then, this was the frontier of all frontiers. And this vine was planted on a whim. At this time, it was planted in something called a mission. So they needed wine that was for religious purposes. They planted vines all over the California coast, all over Central and South America for religious purposes. Now, 99.999% of those vines are gone. But in Los Angeles, there is a vine that is so big around, you cannot wrap your arms around it. It looks like a tree. It feels like a tree. And from this one vine that covers an entire courtyard filled with old gravestones and crosses and statues of the Virgin Mary and Jesus, you get an entire barrel of wine from a single vine planted in the 1700s. And today is an incredibly special day because it's being harvested right now. Winemakers from Cavaletti Vineyards, Angelino Vineyards, and Byron Vladdy Wines have all descended upon this vine to pick all of the grapes that cross this pergola and turn it into something called Angelica. Let's hear from the crew on the ground about this vine and what they're doing today.
So we're here at the Mission San Gabriel in San Gabriel, Los Angeles, harvesting the Ramona vine today. These are the ancient vines that have been on this property since the late 1700s.
What we're picking today is a mix of Mission and Vitis Guardiana. And with that, we're gonna make an old wine that we believe they would have made back in the late 1700s called Angelica.
So the way we're making this wine is the way that they would have made the wine back in the day, the original Angelicas of Los Angeles, which is actually not even to fortify fermented wine. We're actually fortifying or adding brandy or spirits to the pressed juice. So it's honestly, I've never seen anything that looks like this, and I've never tasted anything like this in my entire life.
So Jacy, you have this wine in your glass right now. I know we're jumping ahead here for a second, but I want to know, what does it taste like and what does it smell like?
It's really interesting, Jason, because it's herbal. It's a little bit of floral, but it definitely smells, it's like the fruit is very muted, but it's a little floral and herbal. So let's taste it. Wow.
It's crazy, isn't it?
It's so good. It's so unique. It's so mellow. It's just wow. It's so good.
So what it is it's called Angelica. And Angelica is a very unique fortified wine that gets its name from Los Angeles. And up to, almost the 1930s, Los Angeles' city crest had vines on it. It was known as the birthplace of the vine in the United States. When you know some of these facts, it's not that crazy that this giant tree-like vine is sitting there. But the wine itself, it's a little sweet, touch sweet, because it's fortified. And they ferment it down to, or they harvest it when there's as much sugar as possible in those grapes. But it also has acid. And it's a very, very, very distinct type of wine. I mean, I the first time I had it was during the filming of this, during the harvest, and I was kind of blown away by how could a vine from this age still be making grapes, and how could those grapes be doing this? Now, I should say there are a couple older grapes in the world that are planted, so I'm sure people listening are going to go, what about this? What about this? What about this? In all of those cases, they do pick those grapes. In a lot of cases, they make soap out of them, or they don't do anything with the actual grapes because they don't have enough sugar, or there's just not enough of them to do anything. I want to reiterate, this is a really unique situation because they are actually making the wine that Jacy's drinking out of this. Now, there's not a lot, so good luck finding it.
It really is such a beautiful wine. It's very complex. It has depth to it. It has acid. It has a little bit of fruit to it. It's crazy that it's like from a vine that's so ancient.
So the vine lives in the San Gabriel Mission. And if you've been to Los Angeles, it's pretty famous for its sprawl. There's really not a central part of Los Angeles. A lot of people come here and they're like, well, where should I go? And it's like, well, it's kind of like 5, 6, maybe 10 cities. Santa Monica's over here and Malibu's up there and Long Beach is over here. Then you've got Burbank over here. But the San Gabriel Mission is sort of located, I would say, out towards Pasadena, that direction. And it really, really was one of these remote places. And I think that that's one of the things that helped it stay one of the best preserved missions in California. But there's something really unique about this vine as well. It's been a part of 2 empires and 2 countries, 4 different completely unique places, and the vine's never moved. And one of those is the United States. Jacy, can you talk to me a little bit about what the Spanish missions are? What was that?
Absolutely. So as part of Spain's expansion into the New World, a group of missionaries accompanied the Spanish military to establish Catholic missions, right, all throughout California. Now, at the time, it was just Spanish territory. It wasn't California. To put it in context, this was less than a decade before the Declaration of Independence was adopted. So, this is ancient.
That's insane. I can't.
It's like 1700s. So these missionaries basically built 21 missions all throughout this Spanish territory, which would be known California later on. And the 4th mission was actually the Mission St. Gabriel. And this was like the ground zero of this story, but it was the 4th mission built by these missionaries. So these were Catholic missionaries. So basically, they needed to produce communion wine. So they started planting these vines, and they planted these vines all over every mission. But it was Mission St. Gabriel where this mother vine was actually planted. That's the vine that this wine is coming from.
I find it so fascinating. There's 2 things. One, the fact that this thing survived. We'll get to some of the things that were going against it for still existing. But then the other thing is why this particular vine. And what I want to talk about really fast is the actual grape it is. Now, it's a hybrid, which
Right.
That's not an accident. Very importantly, that's not an accident. Somebody who planted these grapes had at least enough practice with grapes to realize that mixing a European Vitis vinifera with a native grape here in North America was going to be a hardier situation, especially when they were trying to just have, like you said, communion wine. It's not like they were trying to make the best Burgundy in the world. They weren't gonna have Jacy Tops over at Wine Enthusiast rating their wine.
Right.
It was more a very functional type of situation, right? And so I think when you look at this grape and you think, what was it? And they do know that it was a grape called Pais. And now that grape Pais is very, very famously now called the Mission grape. And you can find patches of it all over Southern California, all the way up to Sonoma. But you can also find it in some other wild places like the Caribbean, Mexico, Argentina, Chile. I had the incredible opportunity to film for a film we have coming up in the Dominican Republic, where the very first vines in North America were planted. And guess what it was? It was Pais. It was the
Oh,
mission grape.
Pais. Oh, wow.
Exactly.
Wow.
And so the reason they brought Pais was, one, in Spain, where Pais is really from, it was a pretty hardy grape, and it had good yields. And if you know anything about grapes and vines, for the most part, and I'm not talking about your picky ones like, Pinot Noir or things like that, they can almost grow anywhere. And so throughout the Roman Empire and then later, the Holy Roman Empire and things, you would look on these rocky outcrops where nothing grew, and there'd be two things that could: olive trees and vines. And vines are a pretty hardy thing, but some are hardier than others. And Pais in particular is one of these grapes that almost will run wild. You could trellis it and make it look like a modern situation, but you could also just let it go crazy. And it seems to find a way to survive. And so clearly, these padres, these monks, whoever was at the missions, they knew a little something about viticulture, because they clearly were able to say, it's this grape rather than Tempranillo or a white varietal like Godeo or something like that. This is the one we're going to bring across the ocean on these perilous journeys. And then when they would get up across the ocean, they would have to then travel with this budwood for probably what equates to months. So there was clearly something with Pais that made this very, very, very special. So started in the Dominican Republic, went through Mexico, all over South America, and one of the later places they would have come would have been the Southwest United States, because it was really hard to get to. There was no Panama Canal. You had to either go all the way around South America, or you had to trudge through the jungle or desert. And the inhabitants that lived in these places were generally not very friendly to see Europeans. We spoke with the director of the mission just to get a little bit of history of what the life was like there for these early fathers and padres that came and built the mission, and what it was like when they planted this vine.
Mission San Gabriel is the fourth of the 21 missions built in California. It is one of the few structures that is still in its entirety. This structure is the last of 4 structures that were built during that time frame, during the 246 years that they have been at this site. The building is made of stone and adobe-fired brick. We do know that there were a specific number of vines here on this campus. Because Mission San Gabriel was so large and so lush that it was probably the hub of the other missions. So they probably came here to trade wine. And so for many years, that was probably the work that was done by the Franciscans along with the Native Americans in the area.
Jacy, have you spent a lot of time in Los Angeles?
No, actually, I have not.
Well, I would like to tell you it's a small town. Everybody knows each other. And and it's not vain at all. We're all pretty modest.
That's exactly what I hear all the time.
Yeah, that's definitely the true story. Part of the reason that this story is insane, and it's not just the age, it's just the insane luck that this vine has had. And I think clearly it has to be called just that. Because Los Angeles is one of these places it's gone to be a boom town over and over and over and over again. From its very beginning, it was a place that was kind of undesirable. The terrain here was dry. There wasn't a lot of fresh water. You couldn't really grow stuff. And if you come to Los Angeles now, you see trees, you see neighborhoods. All of that water, I just want to be very frank here, is fake. It's not from here. We steal it from the north, and it gets brought in via. Oh yeah,
wow.
There's a great movie that everybody should watch called Chinatown, which might as well be a documentary about the water situation that stealing the water from the north, a place called Owens Lake. And the reason I bring all of this up is when the Spanish first came here, they were looking at this as basically a pass-through, because up in San Francisco in the north, they found places that were really great natural harbors. They found places where you could grow things along the coast, the Central Valley. But Los Angeles was a place to get from A to B. And the Spanish Empire down in Mexico was a place of unfathomable riches. The gold, we could do 15 podcasts on what happened to the Aztecs and the Mayans and all of that stuff down there. But Los Angeles and what would become Los Angeles was a pass-through place. It was a place to get, stuff to boats and get it the hell out of there and back to Spain, the motherland, which is where most of that gold found its way back. And so it pretty much left religious people and mostly the Catholic Church in these places alone, essentially. They were sort of like the last little stand of the empire until the 1830s or so. The United States was expanding pretty rapidly, and we went to war with Mexico in the 1840s. And that was over this entire territory. And when that happened, and when we won that war, this whole place became part of the United States. And it was no small thing, because this made the United States grow in an enormous fashion. Arizona, New Mexico, California, all of that was just part of New Spain, part of the Spanish Empire, and then part of what Mexico became afterwards. I don't mean to bore all of you kids here. There won't be a test on all of this. I just want you to know there was a moment when we became a state here in California where people started looking at Southern California and thinking, there's some interesting things here. Everything changed in 1848 when the gold rush happened. You had thousands and thousands and thousands of people coming from all over the world to go to California to try to make it rich. And I don't want to say most of those people coming in were the best of people, but a lot of them needed alcohol, and alcohol exploded in Southern California. So much so that Southern California became the place where the most vines in the United States were planted. And nowadays, where do you think, Jacy, when you think of wine in America?
Oh, well, of course, Northern California. You think of Napa and Sonoma.
Where else? I mean, because that's, to me, I think Napa and Sonoma for sure. I think of a little East Coast. You're in New York, right?
Yeah, definitely.
There's some wine out there, some vineyards.
The Hudson Valley, Finger Lakes, absolutely.
Virginia. And back then, I bet like a lot of the East Coast would still have had quite a bit of vines just because it was easier. You didn't have to truck stuff across. And, I would assume in the 1840s, getting from one side of the country to the next is a real pain in the ass. People died along the way.
Yes.
It wasn't a fun situation. And so the amazing thing that started to shift with the railroads being built and the gold rush is people came out here, started becoming a huge population center, and people needed alcohol. And so a lot of grapes were planted down here. And during that time, they developed something called Angelica, which is in your glass. Angelica was this fortified wine that tastes pretty close to I would assume exactly like what we're drinking from the oldest vine. And this is when that developed and became a drink that most people down here could get at bars, at restaurants, at saloons. So it was either that or a brandy or a beer or a whiskey. And the gold rush sort of just brought a ton of people in. And then something really, really, really big happened. After the gold rush, something much more dangerous to this vine happened. They discovered oil. And Southern California went from being the birthplace of the vine with more planted vines than Napa, Sonoma, any of those places, to the largest oil fields in the United States. And this would have been around the turn of the century. It was a pretty staggering amount of money, pollution, and people that came down to this place. And so Los Angeles, as we know it now, there are pictures that you can see where as far as the eye can see, you just have oil rigs. And this vine, somehow, some way, they did not find oil near this mission. And so the vine stayed. Now keep in mind, we're talking about the turn of the 18 and the 1900s. This vine was planted probably in between the 1750s and the 1770s. So it had already been there for, 180 years, which, we were talking about old vines before, and I look at the old vine situation as like, you can find some Zinfandel up in Sonoma. It's 100 years old, but that's really it, right?
But 250?
250 years old.
That's history. That's ancient.
It's one of the things that I think, if you didn't know the story of that, what would you think of that wine in your glass? Because, it's really easy to taste that wine and go, it's really good knowing this. But if you didn't know this, would it still be good?
Probably not as good. To actually be honest, probably not as good. I think wine is conversation. Wine is story. It's not just vines and grapes. So it's like the story behind the vines, the story behind the grapes. that make it more interesting. So I think probably not as interesting if I didn't know the story behind it.
I tend to agree with you, but I do think if you're into dessert wines, fortified wines, I think this is a really, really tremendously made glass of wine. Something we should point out, though, is that this was the fashion of wine. In the 1880s, right now, we buy wines, we expect them to be dry. And I find a lot of people don't still know what that means. They're always asking for a dry wine, and you have to be like, well, it is dry. But back then, wines were sweet. They actually had quite a bit of sugar in them. And they were it was kind of one of the ways people wanted to taste. You wanted to taste. What's your palate like? Do you like any sweet wines, or is it something that you avoid?
I like sweet wines, but I like sweet wines paired with something specific. Cheeses, chocolates, like heavier, richer dishes. So I do like them just paired with something specific.
Right. Yeah, no, I think, well, you know what you should do? Have a couple kids and then you'll drink anything. Because for me, that's how it happened. I was really picky about what I drank until I had 2 children, and then I was like, I'll take it. So I do a lot less pairing. All right, so we're talking about the early 1900s and the mother of all problems for the United States, for drinking, for organized crime, for a lot of other things is coming. And I don't mean the worst problem the U.S. has had. We've got our problems, but if you're a glass of alcohol, this is your big one. And what was that, Jacy?
Prohibition.
Prohibition. You talk about shooting yourself in the foot. Prohibition, as I said earlier when it came to the gold rush. Now, a lot of people have written that people who came out to California for the gold rush, and a lot of people who went to a lot of these other boom towns, Arizona, Deadwood is a famous place up in the Dakotas, people who came seeking a fortune, they oftentimes were not Harvard graduates. It's not to say that they were all unsavory. It's just to say that, well, they drank a lot. And they would drink very hard afterwards. And there are a lot of thoughts that the temperance movement came from the hard living style of that day. Mid 1800s up until 1920s when Prohibition was started, people drank, and they drank a lot. You read stuff about the amount people used to drink. It's kind of wild. They would drink whiskey throughout the day. You'd have, a flask in your pocket and you would just drink alcohol. And then you would get off work where you'd been drinking alcohol and you would drink more, at a saloon until you probably passed out and then woke up and went to work again. But it's just a very different time. And so the temperance movement started building and building and building, and it goes back further than that. But in the United States, the 1850s to the 1920s was a very key time where people were drinking a lot and the temperance movement started to gain. And so when they enacted Prohibition and all alcohol went dry, there was one minor miracle for this vine. There was a piece of the legislation that said, if you are a religious institution, if you are Jewish in temple or Catholic in church or, any religion that requires wine as part of your ceremony, you can continue to make wine. But what happened was places like Napa, which were starting to grow, as Los Angeles was building up giant city, all of those vines started to disappear. And in the north, vines were planted. But when Prohibition happened, it put a gigantic piece of saran wrap over the entire country when it came with planting vines. Almost no more vines were planted, and in a lot of cases, all of the wineries that existed were either shut down or converted into being kosher wine or sacramental wine or these things that just sort of, just to keep going. And I'm trying to think if we have a modern equivalent to something like this. Imagine a whole industry. I guess like during the pandemic, maybe movie theaters or something like that, but it's really a bigger thing.
It was very counterproductive. These people had vineyards and they were selling, like in the South, they had whiskey and they had crops and this country was finding its way, and Prohibition just canceled all of that and sent everything underground. And it just kind of made everything go underground, and it kind of cultivated everything illegal.
It was very illicit. It's not hard to make alcohol. Let's be honest. If you want to make alcohol, you could make it in a mason jar or in your bathtub or I don't know if people listening to this are familiar with the vinification process, but basically, if you take a bucket full of grapes and you put it in the right place and it's got yeast on it, which it probably would, and just let it sit there, it's probably going to start fermenting. I mean, grapes on their own will do that. Now, don't get me wrong, it's going to taste like shit. So my apologies, everybody.
Yeah, it's not going to taste
But
so good.
it will happen. And so when you think of it that way, you think of what ended up happening was alcohol didn't go away. It just became something that was controlled by someone else. And in comes the mob, in comes organized crime. And there was a lot of money to be made in this. So during this process, this vine, and here's where the vine gets really interesting, because during Prohibition, they continued to grow the vine and the Mission did not get ripped down. A whole city was built around it. If you're in the Mission, it looks like you're in a place that was built in the 1700s. And it's a very large complex. You know, there's a graveyard outside, a very large graveyard. There are incredible worship centers in there. There are very old rooms that have very old things in them. I mean, old winemaking equipment, all of the things that the priests and the monks who live there would use for their living quarters. But you take a step out and you're like, well, there's a Jack in the Box and, oh, there's a Wendy's. And I mean, it looks like a normal town with cars all over the damn place and freeways right by it. And so it's sort of a miracle that it exists. But what did happen was that during Prohibition, they just sort of stopped making wine out of it. The place kind of fell into a bit of disarray. What ended up happening was it got on the National Historic Registry many years after that, and the vine itself was forgotten. So outside of a little bit of work people had done on it in the 60s and 70s, just pruning it, they weren't really doing much. They weren't paying attention to the grapes. It just sort of just grew and wrapped its tentacles around all of the wood on the premises and everything. And it was not until 2020, during the pandemic, that 3 Los Angeles winemakers who have spent nearly a decade trying to bring Los Angeles wine back into the consciousness stumbled upon this story. And they are the winemakers for Cavaletti, Angelino Wine, and Byron Blatty. Let's listen to some of them talk about when they made the decision to start making wine from this vine.
The Los Angeles Vintners Association was founded by 3 wineries. None of us knew each other. We were all starting our wine projects or wineries around the same time, independent of each other.
It was just so cool to find other people who were crazy enough to do this and obviously also drank a lot because they thought the same idea would be good.
We walked in and walked the grounds and just started looking around and saw these insane old vines, like huge things that you've never seen before. They look like these twisted like monsters coming out of the ground, and we were blown away by what we saw. And then of course we looked up into the pergolas and there was grapes hanging, and right away we knew we were going to make some wine.
Then we looked at all the grapes and said, who does something with this? Like, what happens with these? And she said, well, we just cut them off and the birds eat them. And we were like, well, okay, time out. We can do the cuttings, but can we make wine from this? So that's kind of how this whole project got started.
What I really love about this project is that we make it together as kind of a collaboration with all of our friends in the winemaking business here in LA.
The wild thing about their decision to do this is it's not a profitable one. This vine makes, it makes at most 1 barrel of wine. And that's not, it might sound like a lot of wine, but it's not enough to do anything commercial. You need permits for every bottle. You need all sorts of legislation, all sorts of little things that have to be approved by, governing boards. And by the time you do that, you're at a net loss of selling this wine. So they did this with the complete belief that if they could make this story known, that this vine still exists, the heritage of Los Angeles, that they were doing something to bring the history of that story to the wine drinker and to the city and to the United States. And I wonder how surprised people would be to find out that the oldest vine in America that is making, the oldest vine in the world probably that is making wine is in Los Angeles. It just feels like a wild situation to me.
It is wild. I'm shocked. I had no idea that Los Angeles made wine.
When I came here, I didn't grow up here, but when I came here about 14 years ago, right after I got into the wine sort of space by making SOMM, somebody threw that across my bow. And I have to say, very snobby, I sort of thought that wine must be terrible that they're making here in Los Angeles. And I met Mark Blatty, and we did a Behind the Glass, which is one of our series that we do on SOMM TV, and my head exploded. Honestly, I know these people, they're my friends now, but these wines are stupendous. The first thing he did to me, now we're going to talk about Cabernet and some of the more traditional grapes for a sec. He blind tasted me on 7 glasses of Cabernet. And he said, I want you to rank these in order of what you like. He said, you take as much time as you want. And I was like, I don't normally do this kind of thing. He's like, no, I'm not, it's not for anything. It's not public. It's not a rating. He goes, I just want to know, what do you like best? So I took these glasses and I lined them up in the order of what I thought was the right one. And it turns out he had picked like Opus 1 and Stag's Leap Cellars, the great of the great Napa wines. I mean, a lot of these were $400 a bottle type of stuff. And he had his Los Angeles Cabernet. And the vines come from places like Bel Air. You'd never imagine. These vineyards are sitting in wealthy people's backyards, on hillsides. Some are totally forgotten. He helps maintain them and gets to take some fruit for the privilege. And I ranked it as the second best wine in all of them.
Wow.
It was mind-boggling. And so after that moment, I realized something very important about wine. It's that, A, you never stop learning, and B, you go ahead and make a hot take or think something subjective, and if you wait long enough, something's going to come and knock your socks off on what the truth is. Because wine in Los Angeles, if you take away the buildings, you take away, some of the other things, the noise and all of the chaos, it's a pretty good climate for wine. It's actually not, it's kind of perfect. And so I didn't really think about it that way. I was just thinking that nobody was making good wine. So this vine that we've told this story of, it only goes to cement that even further, that if there's a history and there's a will, there's a way. And so what would you like people to take out of this besides the hope that they can taste this wine, the Angelica?
Never stop learning. Like, the second that you think you know everything about wine, there's always something that you can learn more about wine, and never assume that just because you are in the quintessential, the best area, that there are other areas that make exceptional wine. That's what I've learned from this story. I mean, this story is amazing.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I want to tell all of you listening to the Wine Enthusiast podcast or the SOMM TV podcast, you can watch this documentary on SOMM TV, or you can watch the episodes on Mark Blatty. You can watch tasting notes on this Angelica with our own Claire Copey. But it's an honor to do this with you, Jacy, because I think, for you to be based on the East Coast and to be able to think about this, I know it's not a stretch to think there's good wine in California, but it is a stretch to think that the oldest vine in the world making wine is in Los Angeles.
It's in Los Angeles.
So, yeah, I want to say cheers to you, Jacy. It's been a pleasure, and I hope everybody checks out the documentary and listens to your podcast.
Thank you so much, Jacy. Thank you for having me. This was so amazing.
All right, talk soon.
Cheers.
All right, cheers.